Hello, I'm Glen Darling from the IBM Edge Application Manager team, and I'd like to tell you about deployment using patterns and policies. First of all, what is IEAM? It's IBM's commercial distribution of the Linux Foundation's Edge project called Open Horizon. It's our single pane of glass for containerized software management on both Kubernetes clusters and standalone Linux computers. Your intent. IBM's IEAM agents are autonomous enforcers of your intent in the form of either software deployment patterns or software deployment policies across your entire fleet. Our approach frees you from having to prescriptively detail the software deployments for each of your edge nodes, which becomes very unmanageable at scale. So patterns or policies. Patterns are generally easier to use, and so we usually suggest that people start using software deployment patterns. And in them, you directly specify which services will run for anyone who is registered with a particular pattern. But it's much less powerful and flexible than the policy mechanism. With policies, you just declare your intent, and it uses a constraint-based resolution mechanism, and the agents resolve their node policies against any service policies that are attached to your services and any deployment policies. And the three of those together make their software deployment decisions. Now, let's look at each of these tools in a little bit more detail. First of all, deployment patterns. A deployment pattern is just a named collection of services. You specify the services you want, and then IEAM adds any stated dependencies transitively. So if this service uses that service and that service uses another, all of those will be brought in if you specify the first service. And the way that you publish your software deployment pattern is with HZN Exchange pattern publish, and give it the details that I'll show you in a moment for your pattern. And then that will create that pattern in the Exchange. Then when you register your nodes using the name of that pattern. So HZN register -- pattern, and then the name of the pattern. And then you can set configuration variables either uniquely for each node. So at registration time, you can specify values for configuration variables for each node. Or you can use the Exchange to set them on individual nodes, or you can set them globally for the entire pattern. But the one main restriction for the pattern mechanism is that only one pattern can ever be active on any one edge node. And here's an example pattern. It's a JSON structure that specifies a list of services. You see the services I've put in bold there, and each service has a 4-tuple to identify it. Its organization, its URL. The URL is really just a unique name. It's called a URL for historical reasons, but it's just a name. And architecture. So it can be whatever hardware architecture this service is able to provide. And then version numbers that are acceptable for deploying this service. And there are other things there, like the name of the pattern at the top that you would use to register nodes, and then various things like label and description that you can use for the humans. And public indicates whether people in other organizations can use this pattern because IBM Edge Application Manager is a multi-tenant service. Now let's talk about policies. Policies are much more interesting, and there's 3 types. In order to use the policy mechanism, you need to define a deployment policy, and you'd use HZN Exchange deployment add policy, and then provide the information I'll show you in a moment about the policy details. And optionally, for each of your services that you're going to be deploying, you can define a service policy, and it will automatically be merged into any deployment policy that references it. So to create a service policy, you use HZN Exchange service add policy, and you indicate which service it should be added to and provide the details that I'll show you in a moment. And then when you register your nodes, you register them using a node policy. So this is similar to the registration I showed you a couple of slides ago with HCN register minus minus pattern when you're using a pattern. But here it's HCN register minus minus policy and the name of the policy. Constraints and properties. All policies have both of these, and either of these lists can be empty. But properties are just name value pairs. So you see name my stir var and value my stir val. You can put any name you like, any value you like. They're typed, so you can have Boolean, string, uh, number values for your properties. And then constraints are logical expressions in terms of the properties. So some var is greater than or equal to 2000, other var is equal to the literal string value. And there are many other possibilities. It's a fairly powerful language you can use. There's Boolean expressions and um, lots of comparison operators. So there's the properties, there's the constraints, and here's an example deployment policy. So there's properties and constraints you can put in there, like I showed on the previous slide. And then there's a service as well that is a four tuple like I showed you before that identifies the one service that's attached to this policy. And note that in deployment patterns, you can have multiple services in a single pattern, but in a deployment policy, you can only identify a single service, and then any services that it uses transitively will also be included. But the top level service, each top level service needs its own deployment policy. This allows you to have independent life cycles for different applications that you want to run on the host. So how does policy work? First of all, your deployment policy is automatically merged with any optional service policies that are defined for the one specified service in the deployment policy. The agreement bots or agbots then propose that merged policy to every edge node agent. Then each edge node agent independently evaluates this proposal against its own node policy. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Only then will the agent proceed to download and validate the specified service and run it. So let's talk about policy evaluation. The properties referenced in the constraints must exist either within another policy under evaluation or be provided by the agent. And I put a little note there that the agent automatically provides some basic properties like information about the hardware that the node has, like how much RAM it has, how many CPUs it has, that kind of thing. And then each agent evaluates both the constraints of its node policy and the constraints of the merged deployment and service policy using the complete set of properties under evaluation from the node policy, the service policy, the deployment policy. And because that's relatively complex, there's another tool that you can use to simulate what effects a policy will have on your fleet in the field by using HCN deploy check and specify which policies you should evaluate together, and it will tell you whether it will deploy to your, which machines in your fleet it will deploy to if you use that policy, if you publish that policy. So typical usage, I wanted to put this slide in here because it can be overwhelming thinking of the three different types of policies and how to make use of such a generalized system. When I use it, I tend to define only the properties in the node policies. I never use constraints in node policies, and I use them to describe the node. For example, to give it a unique identifier, to give it its intended role, its characteristics and capabilities. And then when I write my deployment policies for my services, I tend to define only constraints, no properties. And so my constraints can then easily implement complex intent like run this service on any smart cameras that are monitoring doors at my retail stores in North America. And then the agents will automatically make that happen. So a quick summary. Patterns are simple. They're a good place to start, but policies are much more capable. Policies can be attached to nodes, services, and deployments. And we have in mind that we would like to have additional policies in future, but currently it's those three. All types of policies may contain properties and/or constraints. Agents individually and autonomously evaluate all the policy proposals that are provided to them by the agbots, and only when the agent's node policy matches up with those other policies will it act. And often the node policies only specify properties. That's what I use. And often the deployment and service policies only specify constraints. That's what I use. Using policies frees you from ever having to be prescriptive and itemize your nodes. You never need to say this node, this node, this node are going to run this software. Instead, you use generalized logical expressions to define which sets of nodes, and that is much, much better at scale. Imagine having a million diverse edge nodes, many roles, many places. You don't want to be trying to maintain multiple lists of nodes that have different characteristics. You want them to think for themselves about which software is appropriate based on your intent. Yeah, large and error-prone task. So in contrast, it's nearly trivial when you use a policy approach with a constraint-based resolver. So this decentralized approach is also highly efficient since each agent independently evaluates all the policy proposals. Then only if they resolve locally will that agent independently download, independently verify, and then run your services. If you'd like to see some examples of the policy mechanism, you can take a look at the Open Horizon examples. Each one has a Horizon directory or a policy directory that contains the JSON files for different policy types. And also, typically, the examples contain a software deployment pattern. So you can see those examples. And here's a link to get you started there. If you wish to see some more, there's additional videos on the IBM Developer YouTube channel. And there's a link to the IEAM playlist there. There's also a link here to the Linux Foundation's YouTube channel, Open Horizon playlist. So I made many of the videos in that playlist as well. And there's some hands-on examples there using Open Horizon, which is what IBM Edge Application Manager is based upon, to deploy using either patterns or policies. And here's the official documentation for IEAM and the product page for IEAM. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me at glendarling@us.ibm.com.